Hello, viewers and listeners. Today our topic is the future of education and online education. And our guest is Wes Weston. Wes is an online English teacher, entrepreneur, founder of the YouTube channel Interactive English, and online English courses. I'm personally improving my English on his channel and using his other English courses to improve my communication skills. Wes, hi Wes, welcome to my channel.
Hi Alexander, thank you so much for having me.
Okay, Wes, could you tell us about your outstanding courses, English courses, and online activity?
So we are, kind of in process of growing and developing our school. We started with the YouTube channel, Interactive English, to put out these video lessons and really try to promote more active language learning and getting learners, anybody who's watching, a way to engage and interact with the videos. And from there, we've just been working on courses for vocabulary, speaking, and it's just a work in progress, and we keep trying to grow and develop the school in different ways in order to make it more, to me, just to try and make English education more accessible, number one, but also more affordable as well, so that many people can have access to these videos and these lessons.
Great. Wes, could you tell us a short story when your student achieved a strong advanced level in English unbelievably fast?
Yeah, I would say that there's not one in particular that stands out. There's a few of them, but the example that I would give you is right now, my family, my wife and I, we live in Europe. Before we met in California, and we were both working at a language school that it really helps prepare students for university. So we would have students come over there and they would study for 9 months, possibly even a year at a time. And the one thing I would notice is that we would have students come in at a very low level, pre-literate, they didn't know how to read and write, and just very basic English. And they'd study for a long period of time. And you could really tell a difference between the students that tried to integrate themselves into the culture, tried to make a lot of friends that were also native English speakers, so that they were learning English at school, but they were also getting practice when they left school. Because some of the other students, once they left school, they would just hang out with other friends from their country. They were only speaking their native language, and they would really only get English when they came to class, even though they were living in the U.S. So I think when the students that ended up getting that immersion, that full immersion, you could tell a huge difference between their progress, that they improved so much faster than the other students that were just in class, and then once they left school, they weren't really getting much practice at all.
So, Wes, so what main method of learning English did you use with these students?
We followed a curriculum, but that's a good question. There's so many different methods and approaches out there. And of course, everybody is a different type of learner. So for example, for me, I am definitely more of a visual learner. But I think one approach that I've used throughout my teaching career, I've been teaching English for almost about 15 years now. It's an approach that's called Content and Language Integrated Learning. Sometimes it's abbreviated to CLIL. And basically what it is, it's kind of like, think of an international school. If student is, let's say in France, and somebody speaks French, they go to an international school, and instead of just taking an English class, they're learning all of these other subjects in English. They're learning math in English. They're learning science in English. And that's basically what this approach is that you are teaching learners something else, but you're using English in order to do that. So at the same time they're learning about, could be history, really could be any topic, they're learning the language as well. So it's facilitating learning of some topic and you're using the English language. So that's one of the, I guess, my favorite approaches to take, because that way it kind of ties into motivation. You're really able to find out, okay, well, what are the students interested in? If they're interested in, I don't know, it could be like cooking. If they're interested in technology, you're able then to use that to facilitate learning the language. And I think that's really helpful and meaningful.
Excellent. Wes, tell us, please, about all benefits of online English, online English and education.
Yeah, I think that, well, the first thing, I think it really does make it more accessible to everyone. That if you want to, one thing I always tell people is try to get as much exposure to the language as possible. And now with the internet, people can go online and you can watch videos, like on our YouTube channel. You can really spend a lot of time listening to the language. Speaking is a little more of a challenge, but it's really made language learning so much more accessible. There's a lot of, well, like YouTube, a lot of free content out there. And I also think that even if you want to take an English class, there are so many more affordable options out there. Instead of going to a school, you can go online, find teachers. There's a lot of different businesses out there where I think it is more affordable if you want to take even one-on-one lessons or even just do like a small group class. And that's something else that we're developing as well, trying to even make it broader and have these larger classes, but also make it be a lot more affordable as well. So I think those are two big things between accessibility and affordability.
Mm-hmm. Wes, what's wrong with traditional educational system?
I think, well,
why this system is failing now?
I think, and this is what I think it transcends across a lot of educational, whether it's language or science. So much of it, like that traditional model, is assessment based. Mm-hmm. And for example, let's take English. When we would have those students come to our school, they're preparing for university. Just about all of them would need to take the IELTS, which is the assessment exam that's part of Cambridge. And you would use that score in order to get into university. And they say, okay, your English is high enough to where you can understand the classes. But a lot of these exams, when people are given these marks and testing, they don't take into account so many other things that what, in my opinion, would make somebody successful at learning a language or learning anything, like motivation. They don't take into account, you can't really test somebody on their leadership skills. So these are all attributes that I think are highly important to education, but at the same time I understand that a school really, you can't, it's so difficult to test those things and assign some sort of value so that a person can have an opportunity at university or a job. So it's really difficult. Again, I don't really know how you would move away from that model, but I think that is something that educational institutions need to look into, or at least changing the exams to really reflect a lot of these other things, like I just mentioned, about people's motivation, their leadership, just other forms of competency that I think would make them very successful.
Wes, I know that thanks to COVID-19, now we are able to pass IELTS and Duolingo at home. Mm-hmm. So, traditional school worth it?
Yeah, I think it's really going to change a lot, especially afterwards. I think a lot of people are going to move more toward online education. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see how it changes afterwards if people start to go back to these traditional schools. In some countries where I've lived, for example, the first country I started teaching English in was South Korea. And English education, especially these like after school education systems where the students would study at their regular school and then they would come to a language school. That was a huge business. And it'll be interesting to see how much of that changes afterwards, once all is said and done, if more people will just try to do online learning, because it has some advantages and it has some disadvantages.
Great. So, Wes, what should we take away from traditional school and what they don't teach us at traditional school?
I would say one thing that I would think, I guess a lot of these schools, depending on the country, it really varies as to how they run their classrooms and kind of what the learning objectives are. I'm definitely a big advocate for more interactive learning, which is kind of why we called it interactive English. And I would hope that one thing that I would say is that I feel like, this is just me personally, I feel like the best education is usually done at the primary level, when you're talking about primary school teachers with young kids who do a lot more engaging activities, mostly because they're kids and you really need to keep their focus and you want to keep their attention. And then as you kind of go up and you get to even university and you have these longer just lectures and discussions, sometimes I just don't feel like that's as valuable. I'll give you an example. For when I did my master's in TESOL, which is teaching English to speakers of other languages, the most important thing that I thought that they could do would actually be to get the students up in front of the classroom and actually try to pretend they're teaching and try to conduct a lesson. And they did that a little bit, but I think they should have done a lot more in order to prepare the students to prepare us for what many people were getting ready to do, which is to go into a classroom, stand in front of a bunch of students, and actually conduct a lesson. So I think there could have been a lot more practical lessons to really engage, like really gear students, or really prepare the students for what they would be doing, instead of just more, let's talk about theories and approaches. I think that's good, but I think you really need that practical part of it. So I would like to, especially at higher education, I think that would be a lot more valuable to have.
Wes, in your opinion, should people go to college in nowadays?
I guess that really depends. I've always thought, I would say it depends on the country. I think I'll take the United States for an example.
Yeah.
I feel like there was, over the last few decades, there's been a really strong push to say, look, everybody should go to university. And I think it's good, but at the same time, there are other problems that go along with it. For example, in the United States, university is incredibly expensive. And a lot of people can't afford it, so they take out student loans and then they get into debt, and that causes a lot of problems because they graduate from university and then maybe they don't get a job within the field that they studied because there's nothing available, or maybe they decide, I don't want to do this now. And then that becomes a problem or a challenge. So in a place like the US, I think vocational schools, there's room for more vocational schools for people to try and study something that has more of a focus, whether it's doing mechanical work, and really allow students to engage in that and prepare them more adequately for when they finish. And I think in doing that, it may not be as expensive, so that they have all this debt. I have friends that have finished university, they have $40,000, $50,000 in debt, and then they decide, I don't really want to be a lawyer, and then it's really a problem because they have all this debt, but then they really want to be able to do something else. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, that's how I wish it would change in the US, that maybe there'd be more options and more affordable options too.
Excellent. Wes, why majority of students can't find a job after graduation? Maybe who is guilty here? Maybe students because they procrastinate their time. They just want to have a fun. Or maybe it's educational institutions. They promise to deliver good education, but they don't deliver really important, valuable skills for labor market.
I think it's a little of both, especially what you just hit on at the end about not preparing them for what the labor market demands. So, for example, let's take a university in the U.S. I'll take myself as an example. When I studied and went to school, I studied business management, and when I finished university, again, I think that really there were opportunities for me. I decided at that point I didn't really want to do business. I wanted to do other things. I wanted to travel, and that's kind of how I got into teaching. But like my wife, she studied history. Now, there are a lot of options for people to study different disciplines in university, like history being one of them. And I think it's great that people have that option if they want to study something within the humanities. But at the same time, that's not necessarily preparing people for when they finish that you can go out there and get a wide variety of jobs that are related to history. So I think that's I think that's part of both the problem in that when some students would go to university, they have that option of like, well, what are you interested in? And somebody, okay, I'm interested in art. All right, let's do that. But at the same time, once they finish, that there may not be that many jobs available to them. So I think it kind of, or at least like going back to the money part of it, I feel like at least the cost of university should be commensurate depending on what the jobs they would have afterwards. So for example, if some student had to pay a little more for an engineering degree, that might make a little more sense because they are likely to get a job and it's probably a better paying job. But if a student is paying a premium to get a degree in art, then that can be, I think, problematic afterwards because the likelihood of them finding a job may be a little more difficult and they may not be making as much money as well. So I think it really is, well, it's up to the students to really decide where they want to put their energy and think about, well, yeah, what are they going to do with their career afterwards? But also, I think up to the university to try to encourage students to go the right way, but also if they decide they want to do something on their own and study like art or history or something else where that might not be too competitive in the labor market, that it's not going to put all of this debt on them when they finish and get their degree.
Wes, you know different educational systems very well. Tell us, please, for people who want to be enrolled at university, a difference between US and EU educational system. I mean advantages and drawbacks between these two systems.
One thing that I thought was interesting that from my experience, but also talking with some other people that have experienced both education systems, especially I feel like when you think about primary, middle school, and secondary school, I found that I think people think it's a little more challenging in Europe, for example, and I think some of it's almost ahead. I remember talking to she was a visiting scholar from Poland, and she was in the U.S. studying. She came to our school, and she had her daughter, I think, was in 6th or 7th grade. And when she enrolled in the school in the U.S., she had already done the material when she was in Poland. So it's almost like the school in Poland was ahead of where the U.S. was. One of the differences, they said that one of the things they liked about the U.S. is that in the U.S., I think some of the schools, they really try to encourage a lot more creativity, like, hey, if you get the wrong answer, don't worry about it, pat on the back, keep going. There is like this real American optimism, and it can be both good and bad. But I think part of that optimism is what helps create this environment. I think a lot of people in the U.S. want to, when they finish, they want to do things like they want to start businesses, such as, we're trying to start interactive English, and they want to become entrepreneurs. So I think that is a good thing about the system in the U.S. I think a drawback is
entrepreneurship.
Entrepreneurship, exactly, yeah. They want to start their own businesses, be entrepreneurs. I think the drawback is, I think, again, you kind of can set some unrealistic expectations that people want to try maybe and start a business, and perhaps they're not ready to, and they don't succeed, and sometimes that failure can be a bit tough. So I think it really just depends, and I think it's interesting to kind of see the differences between that some countries are taking. Like I had mentioned South Korea before, and the South Korea system is very rigid in what I would say is rigid. I mean that it is just, study, that these kids do kind of all the way up through high school. And, from my view, you go into that system and you think like, wow, this is too intense. They're just kids. They should have a little more time to themselves. But I think if you were to take their perspective of the U.S., could be, well, these kids are lazy, there's too much free time, like what are they doing? So it's interesting just to try and understand that each system is different. There's going to be pros and cons. And as to which one is better, I don't know if it's, if you could sit here and say like, well, this one system is clearly better. I think they all have advantages and disadvantages. And again, I think each country, each person growing up just needs to try and figure out, well, what's best for them in their style.
Wes, what do you think about education system in Finland? And if I'm not mistaken, Japan has the same education system. Pupils don't get in this country marks, without marks.
It's just like pass-fail.
Yeah.
I kind of like that, to be honest.
Why?
I think that, again, you take away, I think, some of the labeling, that competitiveness of, marking people as, from 100 down to 0. I like the idea of just being able to have students focus on learning in general instead of focusing on specific things. So we can go back to the IELTS. And if you're talking about, let's take learning English and having students say, focus on learning the language so that you can communicate and try to achieve fluency. Instead of, if somebody were to come to me and say, I'm trying to get a good score on the IELTS, you end up teaching to the test. And instead of trying to teach the language, you say, okay, let's look at the test. What do they want you to be able to do? And you just end up teaching those specific skills and not really the language in general. And I think that can apply to different subjects as well. So instead of teaching, you try to, whether you're teaching history, science, math, you can try to just teach them in general. They either know it or they don't. Instead of like knowing, for a teacher, like, okay, this is the test that they're going to get at the end of the year. I need to teach them these specific things. And then you end up forgetting about these other things that might be very important as well. So I personally, I kind of like that system, even though I don't think other people might not care for it as much, because then you're not able to get really distinguish between the students that are excelling and maybe that need a little more help. So,
okay. So Wes, tell us about importance of motivation and self-education.
I would say that especially when it comes to language learning, motivation is very important. I think it's important that people understand what their motivation is. If they have an intrinsic motivation, which is they really want, they're motivating themselves to do it, either for work opportunities, maybe travel, or their own personal reasons, or if there is some extrinsic motivation, for example, like they have to pass a test. So I think when people, if they're able to understand what their motivations are and then try to use that to continue learning the language, make it easier, make it more fun, especially those intrinsic motivations to really understand, okay, well, what is it that makes you want to do this? What is it makes you want to improve? So I think, yeah, motivation is key.
No. Wes, how rich people educate their children?
Wait, how are like the rich people?
Educate their children.
Um,
Teach their children.
how do they do it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Wes, sorry for interrupting. For example, I can tell you that Elon Musk built his own school for his kids.
oh, okay. Well, yeah, I'd say in that case, obviously, I think they just have a lot more opportunities, I think, afforded to them, whether
Yeah.
it's going for after school stuff, maybe a private tutor, if somebody identifies a weakness that their child needs more help with. And again, this is another problem, I'd say, a problem in the US system as far as public schools go. I don't know if especially if people aren't from the US, public school, the funding, much of it is based on property taxes. So if somebody lives in a very wealthy area and they pay a lot of money for property taxes, the public school in that area is going to be well funded. They're going to have more money than a public school that might be in a poor area. So, and because of that, then that one public school in the rich area, they're going to have more resources. They might have better books. They might be able to pay their teachers a little bit better. The school is going to have more resources. So I think that is definitely clearly one advantage that if somebody comes from a wealthy family that they would have. But again, I've taught in other countries, I taught in Namibia. I taught at a secondary school there in a very rural area. So it was the countryside. Most of these kids, their families were farmers. And it was kind of amazing to see, like, some of them were like really highly motivated to get an education because it was so important in that area in order to go to university because they wanted to do something else. They didn't necessarily want to be a farmer. At least they wanted the option to go to university and try to do something else. So that was pretty amazing.
Wes, education for elderly people, how should it look like?
I think that I would encourage, no matter what age somebody is, that I think it's always great to learn new things, especially like learning a language. But I think this is where I think it's very useful to be able to learn based on what people are interested in. So, for example, one common question we get on like our YouTube channel, people would ask me, they're like, "Oh, what should I read?" And my response, unfortunately, is like, I really don't know what people should read as individuals, because I would always tell them, like, try to find something that you want to read, that you're interested in learning about, because then you're more likely to continue reading. So I can tell somebody what I'm interested in, but maybe if I recommend that book or that story, maybe they don't like it, and then they're probably not going to finish it, and then that doesn't work out very well. So I think especially it's important whether somebody's older or no matter what age, to really find the things that they're interested in order to promote their language learning.
Wes, from your point of view, which country has the most effective education system now?
Ooh, that's
Yeah.
yeah. Like I said, I think that you get good and bad things from each one. So if you can pick and
Maybe
choose certain things,
from my point of view, pretty good education system has Sweden.
Sweden. Okay. Why do you
Yeah.
think that?
Uh, Average people
Hmm.
were very educated. They know English very well. They know they have very good knowledge in physics, math, in fundamental subjects.
Hmm. Another thing, like I think talking about like Scandinavia,
Yeah.
that they do, I think education is very accessible, and not just at like the lower level, but university as well. And I think that really helps people, especially at a younger age. Like in the U.S., they don't have that, and I think that's a problem. That if somebody is not rich, and in the back of their mind they're thinking like, oh, what am I going to do when I get to university? That's a problem. How am I going to be able to afford that? And I think it causes unnecessary stress and anxiety for when they're trying to go through middle school and high school. And you don't have that in places like Scandinavia. And I think that's huge. So not just, I feel like what you had mentioned, not just the learning approach, but the government being able to do those things and provide accessible education and just different opportunities. I'll give you another quick example. When I was studying, I was traveling abroad and studying in Spain, and I went to a language school there, and I was there for I think maybe 2 months. But when I was there, there were so many Swedish people at the school, and most of them were, in their 20s, and they were there for a long time. And I would talk to them, and they said, like, yeah, like our government, if we want to go study a language and we want to study abroad, they pay for it. And I was just like, oh my goodness, wait, this is free for you? You don't have to pay for this?
Yeah.
And I thought that was an amazing opportunity to be able to provide for their citizens, that these people, they can go travel abroad, study a language, and not have to worry too much. I mean, of course, the country pays high taxes, but I think things like that, providing those opportunities and making it accessible to everybody, is what the makings of a good system. Apart from the learning approach or the learning style, but being able to do that. So I would agree with you in that regard.
Okay. Wes, what do you think? Maybe organizations like United Nations have to develop a global model of education system?
I think something like that would be, I think they could. I think that would be a little challenging because I think every country's different, every culture is different, and then even within the country, it's going to be a little different. And I think one thing they could start, I don't know how, like in the US, one good thing I think they did was they developed something called Common Core. And what they did was for each of the grades, starting in first grade up from K through 12, establishing what are the clear goals, what are the objectives, and how are we going to get there. But the teachers were the ones who developed that Common Core. And I think that was the right approach, instead of having some government official decide, okay, this is what we need to achieve. I feel like when talking about how to design education, it's good to do it instead of from the top down. I think it's good to do it from the bottom up and start with the teachers and get their feedback of what should we do and how do we do that? How do you think we should do that? And then design the system that what everybody could use. So I think the UN could play a role in promoting something like that. I think it would be challenging for them to design it, but I think if you could take a lot of different countries and really try and do this bottom-up approach of talking to the teachers and getting their feedback, what works, what doesn't work, and then really designing the best system that works for their students would be a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Digitalization, Wes, how digitalization affect on education system? Could you name some significant points here?
Like in terms of what I kind of mentioned before about accessibility and I'd say as far as digitalizing education, are you talking about like the internet in general or using the internet in the classroom?
Yeah, in the classroom, shift to online education.
I mean, of course, like I think it's really been huge for making it more accessible, and I think there are a lot of advantages. I know that's something that a lot of schools are trying to do more of, is using technology in the classroom and trying to incorporate not just computers but cell phones, and having students, they can do polls, they can answer questions. So I think it's very useful because of the world we live in today, and many people want to use their phones and they want to be on social media and do things. I think if teachers are able to harness that and use that to their advantage to incorporate some style of teaching. So I get a lot of responses from teachers who talk about like our YouTube channel, and they'll use it for flipped learning. And the idea of flipped learning, if people are watching and they're unfamiliar with it, is that you're basically having the student do the kind of getting the presentation part of outside of the classroom. And then when they come inside the classroom, it's more activities and discussion and more engaging with what they learn. So we'll do a lesson on maybe a vocabulary lesson, and they'll tell the students, hey, watch this when you get home, because they're on YouTube anyway, watching other things, and they'll watch that lesson, and then when they come back to the classroom the next day, the teacher will have some sort of activity based on that vocabulary lesson. So I think those are really important methods and tools that teachers can use nowadays to promote learning, and I think that's very useful.
Amazing. Wes, how do you see the future of education in 5 and 10 years?
Wow, that's a good question. I think that there's going to be more people are going to start using online learning. I think because it's accessible, the ease. You don't have to travel. You can do it from home. I think it is going to be more affordable. I don't know how it's going to work out, because specifically we're dealing with language learning, and I'm not really sure how it's going to change from there. So I see these new advances in technology where right now people would have like their cell phones, and you can ask questions to your cell phone and it'll give you an answer. And who knows, some point in the future, you might have an app that you can just practice and have a conversation with, and you don't need to talk to a person. So that would definitely change the landscape of what we're trying to do. So yeah, it's going to be interesting how I think education changes, and just the internet's going to change all types of industries and sectors. And I know people talk a lot more about automation and what's going to happen to a lot of jobs in the future. So I think education will also change along with that. And yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Wes, how can people find you on internet, order your services, and support you?
So on YouTube, if somebody were just to look for Interactive English, they'll find our channel. It'll be the first one to come up. There are, I think over 200 video lessons now that we have on there, or our website, interactiveenglishvideos.com. They can go to the website, find out more information about us, our school, the courses. And this year in particular, we're really starting to develop some new things and promote that. So the YouTube channel or interactiveenglishvideos.com, best place to find us.
Okay. So what should people take away from our conversation, and what's your message to people?
What was the last part of it?
What's your message to people?
I guess, I mean, I hope that people would be interested in listening to our conversation. Anybody who's interested in education, especially language learning. And I guess my message to people would be, education to me is just so important, and I hope that everybody understands the value of it, the need for it, and just to keep always keep learning to improve. I mean, I consider myself a lifelong learner, and that I'm constantly learning new things, even things about the English language, which I'm teaching, and I think that's great. And I'm trying to learn different languages. Right now I'm trying to learn Romanian. So I hope that continues throughout my life, and I hope everybody else feels the same, that they just want to keep learning and improving and discovering new things. I think it's just really makes everybody's life that much better.
Wes, thank you so much for joining to us today.
All right, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate it.